We're through the looking glass here, people.
Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and I'm standing in the doorway. Yeah! All right. All right, so before I get this one going, I just want to make a quick acknowledgement of What the Flock TV and his channel, whose work portions of this episode are indebted to. All right, so with that out of the way, if you're all sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. All right, so the absolute insanity that is this episode begins with my search for William George Reed. Right, I came across something that I couldn't access on the internet, but I could in person in the form of an article held on file at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Right? And this article is entitled The Mutual Covenant Between William, James, and Charles Howard and William Reed and Sophia Catherine Reed, April 12, 1833. And so with a title like that, you know I had to go down there and look at it. So I made an appointment and they did. They let me look at it. And so what this covenant is it's a probate land agreement between three Howard brothers, right? William, James, and Charles, their sister Sophia, and her husband William George Reed, and the city of Baltimore for a plot of land downtown. Right? The siblings are divvying up Daddy's vast real estate holdings. It's 1833, and the B&O Railroad is really starting to take off, right? It's starting to make some progress now. And so this contract, in very clear language, is contingent on the Howards and their heirs and assigns of the future to make provisions for the B&O by building alleys and laying and maintaining rail track. And they've generously included a plan for this block and its required improvements, which we'll get to in a little bit. But I want to talk about the contract itself first. And one very interesting thing it says, which may not have anything to do with the story, but on the other side of it could have everything to do with the story, is the condition of the contract. Like the quality of the paper, for a document that's like 190 years old at this point. And again, they just let me handle this thing like it was my own, right? It was in really good shape. I don't know what kind of paper stock they had or anything like that, and this is also true of the Wednesday Club letter that I have. Like there's something about the quality of the paper stock or something that's very interesting. And also of the typeset for this thing. Right? When I look in on it, and I'm not really going to read a lot of this contract, but the typeset is so great on this, and I think, why didn't Abel of the Baltimore Sun have this printing press? Yeah, I guess maybe this just shows the difference in pay grade between the Howards and the Abels of the world at this point. I don't know. But this is again 1833, which is about 4 years before the Sun starts. But also what's a little suspect to me is the handwriting on the front. Like when I pulled this thing out of its file, it's a big document, right? So it was folded, right? And so just as I pulled it out, this is the first thing that you see is this handwritten part. And one thing that sort of just jumps off the page at me, as it were, is that there were clearly two different hands writing this document. All right, the mutual covenant between the Howards, William George Reed, and Sophia Catherine, his wife, right? Received to be recorded the 12th day of April, 1833, at 12 o'clock meridian, right? And this is now where it kind of changes. But I think it's interesting that they put this timestamp on it. The 12th day of April, 1833, 12 o'clock meridian. Which meridian are they talking about? And is this 12 o'clock high noon or is this midnight? I don't know. But, it's clear that, the hand that was writing this either was sitting at an angle or held the paper at an angle the way this slope is. And this is also where the pen stroke changes, right? The top half kind of looks like it was a fatter point, it's sucking up more ink and laying a thicker line, right? And then down below we have a much finer line, right? And also what tips it off that this is two different hands is the C's, right? Here we have, they write Baltimore County Court, right? And the C's look like this. But the C for Catherine up here and Charles is more like a 6. All right, here's an o'clock, right? So here's the C here and here's the C here, right? Two different hands here, right? And I think that's really interesting. And this contract is signed off by one Honorable Judge Kelly. name, and seeing the signing judge's name is Kelly, I want to keep in mind that the Kelly surname is actually a byproduct of the Carrolls. And so the clan Eli O'Carroll, right, where the Carrolls come out of, the surnames out of this clan, right, we have Bowen, Dooley, we have Marr, right, so Bill Marr, right, could be a Carroll, and here we have Kelly or Keeley, right, as well as these others, right, but Kelly is a Carroll name, right, so what we have here is we have a Carroll judge signing off on this land agreement between the Howards and the city of Baltimore, right, and the Reeds, right, and allegedly the B&O Railroad, right, because they're supposed to do so much work for the railroad on this land. All right, so one thing I kind of want to point out is at the end here, this little bit here just seems so like forced on, right, and it's also got like a little bit of a thicker ink line, like he either laid it down harder or dipped his pen in for fresh ink or something, right, but this is definitely some sort of insignia initials or something that he tacked on at the end of his name here. And I really am very curious about that. And could that be a tell that this is a Carroll document and a Carroll transaction? I don't know. I mean, that's just 100%. That's just 100% speculation on my part. But that's the way my apophenia is running wild with this one, right? That's just how it goes. And so before we move on to looking at the property itself, this contract says something really amazing. All right, so they're talking about the improvements they're going to make for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, right? And it says that the parties involved, right, said William Howard, James Howard, Charles Howard, William George Reed, and Sophia Catherine. And then here it says, this is amazing. The said Sophia being specially authorized to make covenants by an act of assembly passed at December session of the General Assembly of Maryland in 1832. So quite a bit of power for Sophia Catherine within this family if she can make these covenants, these land deals, independently. I think that could be a really amazing and telling aspect of this story. Certainly it shows that there's some equality in the female members of the Howard family, no doubt about it. Sophia Catherine was definitely a player, right? You remember she was exceedingly clever, according to Amy Darcy Wetmore. Right? And to show just how official this deal is, right, it was signed and sealed. In wax, of course, and I wonder if this is beeswax, right? But, and I don't know what the significance of the insignia is, if this is a Howard insignia or if this is a Courts insignia, but it is clearly a checkerboard or a weave of some type, right? I think that's very interesting. All right, and so here are all the signatures. All right, we have the Howards, right, and William George Reed and Sophia Catherine down here. And so I just wanted to point out, how official this contract was before we look at the land, right? And so let's take a look at the land. And so this contract between the Howards and the Reeds and the city of Baltimore and the B&O Railroad, right, which is held forth by force of the decree of the Chancellor of Maryland. And it says that the parties aforesaid are respectively seized of 4 adjacent lots of land. The entire parcel of land bounded by Carpenter Alley and Paca, Pratt, and Green Streets. And this is great because I have a lot of reference material for this neighborhood in the forms of the 1792 city plan, the 1804 city plan. I have 2 different 1822 city plans, of course, because it's 22, right? So I have one I call A and the other I call B. Right? I have the 1832 city plan. I have the 1844 city plan, and I have the 1851 city plan. Now, unfortunately, and I thought this was rather strange, I could not find any access to city plans later than this. At least given the time frame I wanted to get this episode made in, so maybe so who knows, maybe there'll be a sequel to this one at a later date where we look at the later city plans. But, what we're going to do is, because I have the year before the contract, 1832, and I have 1851, which is 18 years after the contract. So let's take a look and see if the Howards lived up to their contract. And so Falcon's Maze begins with the fact that this was clearly once Colonel John Eager Howard land, if the children are divvying it up, right? And so let's take a look at what this area looked like in 1792. All right, so here's the full city plan, right? And this up here in the upper left corner is Howard's Woods. All right, so the parcel of land that we're talking about here is just west of the Inner Harbor. It's right over here, almost right where the map ends. Right, so here's a detail of it, right? We have Pratt Street along the bottom, and this is Paca here, right? And so what's missing is Green Street, which would be over here, and Carpenter Alley as the boundary, right? So Carpenter Alley would be is going to be an extension of this, what I read as Whiskey Alley, but I believe it's actually supposed to be Wilkie. We'll find out, I guess, as we go, right? And so this is 1792. And so this is that block in 1804. And I tried to match it up as best I could, right? Pratt Street here. This is Pratt here, right? We have Paca going straight down into Paca here, just to kind of give you an example. And so this block here is the property that we're looking at. And so in 1804, this is what it looks like, right? And so we see that this area is definitely marked for significant development in the 12 years or so between these two city plans, right? And we do see that there are things on this plot in 1792. And they do kind of have that marked here as well. All right, so now the next city plan that we're going to compare this block to, this is 1822B. And again, I tried my best to line it up. We have Paca Streets here, right? We have Paca Street here, and to the left we have Green. Finally, I get to at least show that it is Green Street here. And this is that block down here. There's really not that much progress shown from 1804 to 1822, right? This block to this block, right? But here, at least now, we have Carpenter Alley coming in. Carpenter Alley, Green, Paca, and Pratt along the bottom. This rectangle, this plot here, clearly defined, right? This is the 1822, and to line it up as best as I could, it's this one, right? So again, they don't even show any development on the 1822 A map at all, but on the B, they at least have something here. Moving on to the 1834 map, it's completely obstructed by the number 11, right? It's this block here. And so we have Pratt Street along the bottom, right? And here in 1834, this is railroad track. And it is actually visible on one of the 1822. They actually do have railroad track going back that early, which is really interesting because the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad doesn't even start laying track until 1827. So that's like 5 years in advance. So you can sort of see how far in advance these city plans are, right? So now we're looking at 1832, 10 years after the last city plan, and they don't show anything on this block here, And so this is 1 year before the contract, right? This is 1832. And so it's interesting that, just seeing this, that the next city plan is 11 years later in 1844, right? And this is what that block looks like then. All right, here we have Paca Street. This would be Green, Utah, right? Pratt along the bottom with the rail track on it. And here we have on the left side Carpenter Alley again coming over, right? So this is the block. And 11 years later, nothing. No sign of any alleys or rail track that they're supposed to build on here as part of their contract with the city. I think that's really kind of amazing. You would think that they would show some work being done there by this point, 11 years later. But by the time we get to the 1851, which again is 18 years after the initial 1833 contract, we do now have rail line going from Pratt Street up Paca, right? This is that block, right? This rail goes up Paca now in 1851, and this is the block we're talking about, right? Carpenter Alley. Now they have a few more buildings on it, but nothing to note any rail track and alleys as the contract specifies. What changed about this property that they didn't fulfill their contract? The one that was sealed in beeswax. I mean, there has to be something. Why isn't this work being done? This contract is very specific as to the changes it expects to see on this property. And it provides a plan for them, as I stated. And so this is that plan, right? And it clearly has the borders stated in the contract. We have Carpenter's Alley up top. We have Pratt at the bottom, Green to the left, and Paca here to the right. And thankfully, Green is finally clearly marked, right? And so here we have Pratt Street with the rail line on it and the proposed rail line to go down Paca Street, which doesn't show up until 1851, right? But one thing about the contract is that it states that, right, that the alleys are to be 20 feet wide, that they're supposed to have good and sufficient turnabout or other mechanical contrivances, right? And so, if they're planning on building buildings here and creating 20-foot alleys, how the heck do they expect a train car to turn around on a turnabout in this alley? It just, I don't know how that makes sense, right? And seeing the way that this diagram is, just my more speculative nature makes me want to think that perhaps this is a map for something that's not really related to the B&O Railroad and the building of railroad track at all, but perhaps that these are maybe tunnels right, connecting some of these proposed buildings or buildings that are already there. Because as we've seen, they don't show much development on this plot at all, but stuff was clearly there going back at least to 1792. Right? So I don't know. The tunnel idea makes a little more sense to me than a turnabout, but I don't know. I think it's pretty interesting, but not as interesting as the fact that this plan goes beyond the contract. The contract is very specific in its language between Green and Paca and Carpenters and Pratt. But the drawing goes beyond Paca Street, right? It goes to Utah, right? And it has alleys extending further to Utah Street. And this is where I'm going to point out the initials on these plots. So here we have William Howard, we have James Howard, Charles Howard, and then William George Reed and Sophia, And so to see the way that this is done here, right? The contract, as it's written, doesn't say anything about connecting to Utah Street or any property not bounded by Green and Pratt. And so it makes me wonder what kind of sleight of hand was going on with this contract here. Does it really give, the Howards ownership of the next block without having to write that into the contract because it's on the plan? Or is the plan just because the contract specifically states four adjacent lots? I don't know. It's very curious because this would make these adjacent lots would be across Pratt Street connecting to Utah. Right? So very curious. It just makes me curious as to how much of this area of the city did the Howards own as well. Right? So let's take a look at what was happening in just a little bit beyond this area in 1851. Right down here. This would be the original plot of land from Green to Paca, but now we have what's Paca to Utah. So a lot of development on this. Right? And it really kind of makes me wonder, seeing the way that this is done is, and obviously this plot was owned by the father if they're splitting it up later. How much of this land was actually Howard land, as well as what was happening up north with Howard's Woods and whatnot, And so I wanted to take a look around at what was happening in this neighborhood, a little bit further in 1851. And so here we have our block here, right, with the rail line going up Paca, right? None of the change is made, right? So we have a Methodist church on the lot adjacent, right? We have a Baptist church up here. This is the College of Medicine of the state of Maryland. They call it the university here, marked by these pillars. We have a Lutheran church over here, so the unholy trinity of Protestant churches right here, right? And we also have an infirmary, a hospital on this plot, right? So we have a medical college, a hospital, and 3 churches, on all land that could conceivably be owned by the Howards at this point. And this becomes even more interesting because of what's on this plot today. And so the building that's on this corner right here of Pratt and Paca Streets is the University of Maryland Medical System building, right? And it looks like this. And it was at one time the first hospital for the University of Maryland, as referenced here. University of Maryland Medical System, formerly University of Maryland Hospital. Right? So the University of Maryland Medical Center is one of the nation's oldest teaching hospitals, created in 1823 as the Baltimore Infirmary, which is that building on the map that's just 2 blocks to the west. Right? And so if this building is located on the Howard property of this covenant between the Howards and the Reeds in the city, right, it stands to reason that the building of the infirmary is also Howard property. Right? And if the contract in 1833 states that the aforementioned parties and their heirs or assigns, meaning they expect the ownership of this property to go for generations, if not further, right? And so if that would be true about this property where the University of Maryland Hospital eventually ends up, right? Here's the infirmary, just, kitty corner over this way, right? Here's the original Maryland Institute, which we're going to talk about in a second, right? So if it holds true that this land is supposed to be held by the Howards and their heirs and assigns in perpetuity, right? So too would the rest of this land, if indeed it was owned by the Howards. And so that could mean that the University of Maryland medical system is all on Howard land and still owned by Howards today, or their heirs or assigns, right, as these contracts state. And so let's take a quick look at the College of Medicine of Maryland, right? And here it is. And again, this is right across the street from the property that we're talking about, the covenanted property, the property that I was directed to. And so it was opened in 1813, and it is the oldest building and it is the oldest medical college in continuous use, right? Under the dome drum was the anatomical theater, right? And down below, underneath, is a circular chemistry hall. Interesting how these halls and theaters were circular here, right? So it goes on to state that it's named Davidge Hall today after the founder of the college, one Dr. John Beal Davidge. That it's the oldest public college of medicine and the 5th oldest medical school in the United States. And it was founded by this Dr. Davidge along with James Cock and John Shaw. A little bit of that Cock and Shaw treatment. And also interesting, Cock and the Winner Chicken Dinner. The name, of this associated with coronavirus and stuff. Very interesting tying a cock to the College of Medicine in Maryland. And so these three guys, they opened their small medical theater in 1807. In November of that year, another 11, a mob broke into Davidge's small dome theater, took the cadaver, and dragged it through the streets. And I love that Wikipedia wants to know why. And so in December, the Maryland General Assembly passes a bill to establish the College of Medicine. The Maryland General Assembly giving Sophia Catherine Reed rights to make covenants, right? They pass a bill establishing the College of Medicine on land that could very well be owned by Sophia Catherine Reed, which stands today as the entire University of Maryland Medical Center, as evidenced here by Google Earth. Right, here's our block. This is that building that is the University of Maryland Medical System building. Right, this is our corner of Paca and Green. Right, across the way, this is Lombard Street here. So Carpenter Alley would have dissected this right here, just on the other side of this building. All right, and so now we have Lombard Street up here. This is that College of Medicine building, the Davidge Hall, which we were just looking at. Right over here, directly across the street of this plot, we have the School of Nursing and the Maryland Pharmacists Association. And interestingly enough, up here in this corner, this is the Maryland Institute of Virology. Interesting that they don't have it labeled on my Google Earth Pro, but they do have it labeled on my Google Earth cell phone app, right? And here it is. And so the thing about this plot of land is this is the plot where I found those COVID testing tents that I broke into during my walkabout in the early stages of the pandemic. Right? I mean, these very shoddily put together, these very badly staged platforms to kind of illustrate that, yes, indeed, something was happening. Right? I mean, these things were a joke. But if I had known that this was on the front courtyard of the Institute of Virology for the University of Maryland, I would have taken the piss out of them even more. I mean, this was really, really pathetic. Right? And so now this is that block, that initial Paca Street and Green block, right? And this is what that original hospital would be. The interesting thing about looking at it from above this way is that it actually does show sign that perhaps these alleys were built, as shown in the 1833 plan. Right, here it is. Right, this is that block. Here's an alley. Right, and so now this alley is coming off of Pratt Street, but this is definitely an alley on this side as well. So that would be represented here. Right, so who knows, maybe in finding those later city plans, we'll see more development on this plot. But another interesting thing about this location here, so not only is the location of this plot, being like right in the heart of the University of Maryland Medical Center, so unbelievably close to Camden Yards as well. Right, and here's Camden Yards. Right, here's our plot of land. Right, and so not only is it so close to the University of Maryland Medical System and to Camden Yards, right, Babe Ruth's birthplace is right here as well. Right, here's our plot. Right, here's the School of Nursing. Here's Babe Ruth's birthplace and Camden Yards down here in the lower right. Could this represent Howard involvement in the creation of baseball? And their role in sporting, perhaps? Who knows? Right? Interesting that the lot across the street, this is the one that was marked for James and William Howard, is a massive Marriott hotel. You know, it makes me wonder what kind of was there back in the 18 and early 1900s. Someday maybe I'll check that out. And so not only is all of this incredible, right, that the Howards would own this plot of land and that they would build up the University of Maryland Hospital on it, and it's conceivable that they would own all this other land as well, is that all this other land is really, really close to Carroll land. And we're going to demonstrate that in the 1851 map. Right? This is all Carroll property here. Here is Mount Clair. He's the one who donates the property to the B&O Railroad to build the first railroad station at Mount Clair here. And so now our property is really just a few blocks from the main terminal here. As we go down, here is Paca Street. It's the first turnoff, actually, when you leave the station, or the last turnoff when you're coming in, depending on how you want to look at it. Right? This is really, really close to Carroll property. And so it makes me kind of wonder if this is some sort of, and so it makes me really sort of wonder if this is some form of shared borderland between the two families, between the Carrolls and the Howards. Right? I don't know, it's certainly something to think about. Just as you have to consider that not all of these maps are reliable. These city plans don't necessarily reflect what is actually on those properties, as evidenced by this 1833 plan. You know, who knows how much of this they actually did and what all of this was. You know, there's no telling. And so you can't really trust these city plans and these city maps because the contracts may have them divvied up very, very differently. This certainly demonstrates to me that the reality could be very, very different from the city plans, right? And so I'm going to close this one out with an incredible cherry. When I was setting up these slides and going over all the city plans, you may remember in that 1832 map, because I cracked a couple jokes about it, the property was situated right under the number 11. Now, I'm aware that the number 11 is a very powerful number in our coding. Esoterically, it could represent two pillars, which could be translated as door or gateway. You know, like Boaz and Jachin here, the pillars of the first temple of Jerusalem. And I love this image because it includes so much. But what I love about it the most is that the two pillars are flanked by trees, suggesting that two trees could be gateways as well. And this is very important when you're tracking the worship of forest deities and other pagan gods and knowing that the number 11 is the number of Janus, Roman god of doorways. I thought this was a really astonishing coincidence that the number 11 would turn up right over this plot that we're talking about. Owned by the Howards and today the University of Maryland Medical System building. This just had to be a coincidence, right? Most of these maps are broken down into numerically labeled sections, right? So they had to put the number 11 somewhere, right? I mean, it just had to be a coincidence. There's no way. This couldn't be a doorway now, could it? So I decided to take a look at where the other number 11s were on the city plans that I have. And unfortunately, not all of them are so numerically labeled, but 4 of them were. And so in doing this, an absolutely incredible thing happened. In the very next map, 1844, 11 years after this one, the number 11 turns up in Mount Vernon, right over the building that becomes the Peabody Institute, which is right here today. I mean, this is unbelievable. Are you kidding me? The Peabody Institute has an 11 on it, with its connection to the rise of culture as we know it, you know, music, art, literature, theater. You better believe this is a doorway. And it gets even better because the 1851 map has the 11 right across the street. And the 1851 map does a really good job of demonstrating, right, this is where the Peabody's going to go, right? It's not built yet, 1851. But talking about X marking the spot of where a doorway could be, I mean, this is really unbelievable. And so now the 11 up here, if you'll notice, is right on Reed Street. I mean, this is just getting unreal, the number 11 on Reed Street. Because you may remember that William George Reed's birthday, right, is September 11th. 9 plus 1 plus 1, that's an 11, right? I mean, it's really unbelievable that these 11s are just dancing all over this area of Mount Vernon. And so now here is that block, right? Here's the 11. This is that block. And so unfortunately, I was unable to identify any interesting building on here, but I'm sure that there is or was something very interesting on here. You know, so maybe someday I'll find out what it was. But again, just really remarkable. All right, here's that end of the park here. And this big church, which I have yet to talk about, located here. You know, someday, again, it's all going to come eventually. But it gets better, right? There's more, right? Because in the 1822 A map, the 11 dances just a few blocks to the west and is located here on Howard Street. Coincidentally enough, right? Here's that Mount Vernon area. The first 11 was here. The second 11 was a little bit up here. And so now just to show you, we have Center Street here, right? Howard Street here. All right, the Basilica is right over here. And the most incredible thing about this placement is what's on this plot of land today. All right, so looking at it today, the corner of Howard and Center Street is this. All right, this is Howard going up with the light rail. All right, the light rail runs north and south on Howard Street. All right, and this is Center Street here. All right, so here we have Howard and Center. All right, so this number 11 is right over this building here. As if finding all these 11s at the University of Maryland and the Peabody and on Reed Street weren't mind-blowing enough. Right, let me introduce you to Howard Auditorium. Right, this is just unbelievable. Talk about your gateways. If you're a false paradigm speculator looking to connect the creators of society as we know it today to ancient pagan religions, such as, I don't know, Janus worship, they would need a place to commune and practice their religion. And where do you do that? You do that in the woods. Like Howard's Woods, of course, where 3 of my 4 11s are, right? Where the Basilica is, and the Pratt Library, and the Peabody Institute, and the Maryland Club, and the Washington Monument, where all of these things are. You know, all marked by the number 11. Where Baal is, whose true identity, I guess it may now be ascertained as Janus. Right? Look at that. Cernunnos, maybe, you know, but is typically has different types of antlers, but Janus definitely rocks the goat horns. And so Howard's Woods certainly seems to be the gateway of choice, right? Because when you put Howard's Woods into the gematria calculator, it gives you an 11. And the Howards were the keepers of the gate. All right, so this is all I have for this one, right? It's just unbelievable to me the way this story is turned, right? And so remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until the next one, cheers.